She came out of the winter dark like something the storm had broken and spat back out. Thomas Winslow heard the gate latch rattle before he heard anything else, a thin, metallic sound that cut through the howl of wind and the heavy silence of the stable behind him. He had been working late by lantern light, his hammer resting against an anvil still warm from the afternoon's work. A cavalry horse's rear hoof braced between his knees while he seated a new shoe. He set the hoof down carefully, pushed back from the low stool, and walked to the gate with the lantern held out in front of him, his breath clouding in the frozen air. He almost missed her. She was standing just outside the split-rail gate of the farrier yard, pressed against the post as if the post were the only thing holding her upright. The lantern light caught the green of her skin first, then the dark ridge of her tusks, then the slash of a scar that ran from her left brow down across the bridge of her nose and ended somewhere beneath her jaw. She was tall, taller than him by a full head, broad-shouldered and built like someone had hammered her out of oak and iron, but she was shaking. Not from fear, from cold. Her clothing told the story clearly. Fitted warrior's leathers, deep charcoal and dark brown, the bodice laced tight over a frame that spoke of years of hard fighting and harder living, the breeches tucked into boots that had seen 100 more miles than they should have. A short fur wrap hung over one shoulder, so torn it barely qualified as clothing anymore. There was blood on her side. Old blood, dried to a dark crust over a tear in the leather that told him someone had put a blade into her at some point in the recent past. She did not say a word. She looked at him with steady amber eyes that held no pleading in them, only a flat, measuring stare, the kind of stare that had probably outlasted a great number of people who had tried to intimidate her, or pity her, or dismiss her. She stared at him the way a wolf stares at a man who has wandered into its territory, assessing, waiting. Thomas Winslow looked back at her. He was 31 years old, lean from work rather than from want, with calloused hands and a face that the outdoors had tanned and lined past its years. He was not a big man, not a striking one. He shod horses for the border light cavalry, housed in the garrison fort of Caldmere, a settlement of maybe 600 souls pressed up against the edge of the Ashfin wastes where the Orc territories began. He had been at Caldmere for 4 years, had built his farrier yard from a leaning shed and a strip of frozen ground, and he had learned in those 4 years that the world out here operated on 2 rules. Mind your own work, and do not be deliberately cruel. He opened the gate. "Come in," he said, "before you freeze." She did not move immediately. The amber eyes weighed him again, checking for the catch, for the angle, for the cruelty disguised as hospitality. He held the gate open and waited, not pushing, not retreating. She came in. He brought her into the stable because the stable was warm from the horses and the small iron stove he kept burning through winter nights to keep the animals from seizing up with cold. He settled her onto the heavy wooden bench near the stove and crouched to look at the wound, and she grabbed his wrist before he could touch her. "I do not need tending," she said. Her voice was low, roughened, accented with the rolling consonants of the Orcish clans. "I need water and a place out of the wind. You have a puncture wound in your side that has been bleeding long enough to dry twice," Thomas said, not unkindly. "If you sleep on it without cleaning it, you will wake up with a fever, and fever in cold like this kills faster than the cold does." He met her eyes. "Water and a place out of the wind that I can give you, but I would like to clean that wound first if you will let me. After that I will leave you entirely alone." A long silence. The wind pressed against the stable walls and the horses shifted in their stalls. "Fine," she said, and dropped his wrist. Her name was Mazoga Bloodhorn, and she told him very little of it that first night. What he gathered, from the few terse sentences she offered and from what he already knew of the world outside his gate, was substantial enough. The Bloodhorn warband had been among the 3 clans that held the eastern Ashfin. 3 weeks ago, the border light cavalry had pushed into that territory under orders from the garrison commander, a colonel named Vance Aldrich, a man Thomas had shod horses for and privately disliked for 4 years. There had been a battle at a place the orcs called the Red Shelf, a long basalt ridge above the Ashfin marshes. The warband had been routed. Its chief, a warlord named Groth Bloodhorn, Mazoga's brother, had been captured. She had survived. That was all. She had survived when many had not, and she had walked for 10 days through the winter wastes, and she had arrived at Thomas Winslow's gate because his was the first gate she had found that was not a garrison wall. She slept on the bench in the stable and was still there in the morning, upright, watching the horses the way she had watched him the previous night. Not docile, not grateful, just present and surviving. Thomas brought her bread and a bowl of hot oat porridge with salt, and she ate both without comment, but she ate all of it, and he filed that away as a sign that she was choosing to trust him at least as far as food went. The farrier yard sat on the southern edge of Caldmere, separated from the garrison fort by a quarter-mile of Market Road. It was not a social position. Thomas had designed it that way. He dealt with the cavalry's horses, took their coin, and stayed out of their politics. But Caldmere was a small enough settlement that word moved through it like water through cracked ground, and within 2 days of Mazoga's arrival, the word had moved. He knew it had moved when Sergeant Harwick came to the yard. Harwick was not a bad man exactly. He was a garrison man, which meant he had learned to see orcs as threats to be managed rather than people to be reasoned with. He came with 2 other soldiers at his back, not because he was afraid of Thomas, but because soldiers in Caldmere rarely went anywhere without 2 others at their backs. It was habit or performance. Thomas was never sure which. "Winslow," Harwick said, standing in the yard while Thomas worked a shoe on a dappled gray mare that belonged to Lieutenant Aldrich, the colonel's son. "Word is you have an orc on your property." "I have a lot of things on my property," Thomas said, not looking up. "The gray here, a roan gelding, 2 mules, a very irritating cat, and a variety of tools." "Do not play stupid. The big female. She was with the Bloodhorn warband." "She is a survivor of a battle, Sergeant. She came to my gate. She is a prisoner of war who should be remanded to the garrison." Thomas set the hoof down and straightened. He looked at Harwick steadily. Mazoga had heard this, he knew. She had been in the stable the whole time. She was almost certainly listening. "Under which article of the border compact is a lone survivor required to be remanded without her consent?" he asked. Harwick's jaw tightened. He did not have a quick answer for that because Thomas had, over 4 years of living next to a garrison, made himself familiar with the border compact out of sheer self-preservation. He knew the rules. He knew when he was inside them. "Colonel Aldrich will hear about this," Harwick said. "I expect so," Thomas replied and turned back to the mare. When they were gone, Mazoga came to the stable door. She leaned against the frame and looked at him with those amber eyes and said nothing for a long moment. "You know that makes trouble for you," she said at last. "Yes," Thomas said. "Why did you not hand me over?" He thought about it. He was an honest man and he gave honest answers, so he did not produce a fine speech about justice or equality or the rights of orc survivors. He said, "Because you came to my gate, not theirs, and because I looked at you and saw a person, not a prisoner." The amber eyes held him for a moment longer than they had held anything else, and then she went back inside. He found out over the following days that Mazoga Bloodhorn was not merely a survivor of the Bloodhorn warband. She had been its second-ranking war leader, what the orc clans called a bladewarden, responsible for the warband's tactical formations and its horses. She knew horses the way Thomas knew horses, from the inside out, from a lifetime of depending on them. And she was, he discovered when she began to move more freely in the yard, once her wound had closed, extraordinary with them. The cavalry horses, which were high-strung animals trained to be nervous of strangers, calmed when she walked among them in a way they did not calm for anyone but Thomas. She spoke to them in low Orcish and ran her long fingers along their flanks, and they stilled. He watched her do this one morning and felt something open in his chest that he did not immediately have words for. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "Horses are horses," she said. "They do not care what you are. They care whether you are afraid. And you are not. She gave him a sideways look that contained, he thought, the ghost of something that might become a smile. "I am afraid of many things," she said. "Horses are not among them," he laughed. It surprised him. He did not laugh easily, had not for years. She looked at him when he did it, sharp and assessing again, but not with hostility, with something closer to curiosity. That evening he sat at the small table inside the stable's tack room, which doubled as his office, eating supper from a tin plate, and she sat across from him on an upturned grain bucket and ate the same. He had made a thick stew from dried venison and root vegetables, the kind of food winter demanded, and she ate without pretension or commentary, and it was the most companionable silence he had sat in for a long time. "Tell me about your brother," he said. Stopped chewing, set her spoon down, looked at him. "They took him alive," she said. "After the red shelf, they took him back to the garrison. I know, I hear things. He is alive. As of a week ago, yes, I shoe horses for the garrison, Mazoga. I move through it. I hear things I am not supposed to hear." He held her gaze. "He is being held in the lower stockade. I heard Aldrich talking about using him." The word using made her jaw tighten until the muscle in her cheek jumped. "Using him how?" "As leverage," Thomas said, "to force the remaining Bloodhorn bands to cede territory. They want the eastern Ashfin clear. Aldrich wants to push the border west by 30 miles. Groth is the bargaining chip." The silence that followed was heavy and specific. Then Mazoga said, in a voice that was very quiet and very controlled, "What does leverage mean in practice?" Thomas said, "I think it means a ransom, a demand. They will tell the Bloodhorn bands to yield the land or Groth dies." She stood up. The motion was fluid and instantaneous, and the tack room felt suddenly much smaller than it had a moment before. She was not threatening him. She was simply standing because the thing she had just heard made sitting impossible, and he understood that, had felt that same specific quality of news that could not be received while seated. "When?" she asked. "I do not know. I only caught fragments of the conversation, but I think soon, before spring." She stood at the wall and pressed one hand flat against the rough timber and breathed. He watched her and did not speak, because there was nothing useful to say yet. After a long moment she turned to look at him, and what was in her face was not the flat wolf stare from the first night. It was something rawer than that. The controlled surface had cracked open, and underneath, it was a woman whose brother was in a cage and whose warband was ash and who had walked 10 days through a winter wasteland to survive. "I cannot leave him there," she said. "I know," Thomas said. "I do not have the means to free him alone." "I know that too." She looked at him, really looked at him in the way she had been careful not to do before, the way that admitted something could matter. "You said you moved through the garrison," she said. "I do. You know the layout, 4 years of it. You could tell me where the lower stockade is, how it is guarded." "Yes," he said, "I could." He was quiet for a moment. "Or I could help you get him out." The amber eyes went still. "Why would you do that?" He thought about that with the same honesty he had applied to the first question she had ever asked him. He let the real answer come up rather than a comfortable one. "Because what Aldrich is doing is wrong," he said. "Because I have watched him use people as pieces on a board for 4 years, and I have stayed quiet because it was not my board. But Groth Bloodhorn is a person sitting in a stockade because Aldrich wants land he does not have the legal right to take." He paused. "And because you came to my gate and I let you in, which means I am already involved, and I would rather be involved on the right side." The silence stretched. Outside, the wind had eased to a low, constant moan rather than a howl. One of the horses blew softly in its stall. Mazoga said, "You are a strange man, Thomas Winslow." "So I have been told," he said. "I do not trust easily." "I noticed." Another pause. "Then, but I think I trust you." He felt that land in his chest the same way the laugh had landed, unexpectedly, taking up more space than he had known was available. "Then let us figure out how to get your brother home," he said. They spent the better part of the next week planning, which meant Thomas going about his normal work at the garrison and gathering what information he could without arousing suspicion, and Mazoga staying mostly in the farrier yard, where she was visible enough to be known about but not so present as to draw the soldiers off the market road and into confrontation. He brought her information each evening, and she turned it into maps, drawing with a stick of charcoal on stretched hide, translating his words into tactical pictures with a fluency that was impressive and a little humbling. The lower stockade was a stone-walled enclosure in the garrison's northeast quadrant, 2 guards on a 4-hour rotation, 1 gate, heavy timber reinforced with iron, a single window in the back wall that had been fitted with iron bars set close enough to keep a man in but not close enough to keep wind out, which meant the interior was bitterly cold. Groth had been there for 3 weeks. He was alive, Thomas confirmed, because he was fed once daily, which he had verified by watching the garrison cook's assistant cross the northeast quadrant at mid-morning carrying a tin pail. The timing of Aldrich's ransom demand was more urgent than Thomas had initially understood. He overheard a fuller conversation in the garrison's smithing shed while he was working near an open window. Aldrich intended to send riders to the remaining Bloodhorn bands on the next full moon, which was 12 days away. The message would give the bands 2 weeks to yield a formal cession of territory. If they refused, Groth would be executed publicly in sight of the eastern Ashfin as a warning. Thomas came home that evening and told her. Mazoga heard it standing absolutely still, the way a blade goes still at the top of its arc before it comes down. 12 days, she said. 12 days before the message goes. After that, 2 more weeks before the deadline. But once the message goes, the bands will panic. Some will yield, others will not. Either way, Groth becomes less useful as leverage once the demand is made and the clock starts, and Aldrich is the kind of man who eliminates complications. She knew what that meant. We move before the message goes, she said. Yes. She looked at him across the charcoal map spread on the stable floor and said, Tell me you know a way into that quadrant. He sat down beside the map and pointed. The farrier yard services all the garrison horses. The northeast stable is 20 yards from the stockade. I have a legitimate reason to be there any time a horse needs attention, night or day. He traced a line on the map. This alley between the northeast stable and the garrison's food store, it is not guarded. It runs right along the stockade's back wall. The bars on the window. I have a tool that will deal with iron bars, he said. I am a farrier. I have a bar spreader I use for heavily corroded horseshoes. It will not be subtle, but it will work. Mazoga looked at the map and then at him, and something shifted in her expression, something that was not purely tactical. She had been evaluating him as a resource, as a man with access and knowledge, but now the evaluation seemed to include something else, something that saw him differently. You have thought this through, she said. I have been thinking about what is right for 4 years, he said quietly. I just never had a reason that felt solid enough to act on it. She was quiet. Then she reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the map, a brief, deliberate pressure, and he felt it travel all the way up his arm and into his chest and stay there. 3 nights from now, she said, the moon will be in its darkest quarter. 3 nights, he agreed. The night before the attempt, neither of them slept much. Thomas checked and rechecked his tools, wrapped in oilskin to keep them quiet, and Mazoga sat sharpening the short blade she had kept hidden in her left boot since the night she arrived. He watched her hands move on the whetstone, steady and methodical, and thought about how her steadiness had become, over these 3 weeks, one of the things he relied on without having admitted it to himself. He sat across from her in the tack room and said, Can I ask you something? You can ask, she said, which was as close to an invitation as Mazoga Bloodhorn came. What was it like, walking 10 days through the winter after the red shelf? She kept working the blade. After a moment she said, Quiet. Mostly quiet. The wastes in winter are very quiet. You hear yourself think more clearly than you would like. She paused. I was angry for the first 4 days. After that I was mostly just walking. By the time I reached your gate I had run out of anger and I was down to the thing underneath it. What is the thing underneath it? The blade paused on the stone. She looked up at him. The need to keep going, she said. Not hope exactly, something simpler than hope, just the next step. He nodded slowly. I know that feeling, he said. She looked at him with a precision that felt almost uncomfortable. You do not look like a man who has walked through his own winter wasteland. Mine was not geographic, he said. She waited. I grew up in Westmark, he said. A town 5 times the size of Caldmere. A good town, people would tell you. I was a farrier's apprentice, then a farrier's journeyman. Then I struck out on my own and built a yard and did well enough. And then the man whose daughter I had asked for changed his mind about the match when someone wealthier came along. And then the garrison at Westmark gave their contract to a younger man who charged less. And I stood in my empty yard one autumn and realized that I had built everything I was supposed to build, and it had all decided not to want me. He was quiet for a moment. So I left, came out here. It is good work. It is honest, but it has been for 4 years just the next step. The room was very still. Mazoga set the whetstone down carefully. She looked at him with an expression he had not seen from her before, something that was neither tactical assessment nor guarded wariness. Something that was, he thought, recognition. Then we are the same kind of person, she said. I thought you might say something dismissive, he admitted. I thought about it, she said, but it would not have been honest. They sat in the quiet for a long time after that, not talking, not needing to, the stove ticking as the wood shifted, the horses breathing steadily in the adjacent stalls, and Thomas Winslow thought that he could not remember the last time silence had felt this companionable and this charged at the same time. She was the one who moved first. She leaned across the small space between them and put her hand against his jaw, those long fingers warm from the stove, and she looked at him for a moment with amber eyes that were darker than he had ever seen them and said, I have been watching you for 3 weeks. I know, he said, his voice rough. Not like I watch a gate for threats, she said. Different from that. I know, he said again. She kissed him. It was not tentative. It was honest in the way she was honest about everything, direct and deliberate. And he kissed her back with everything he had been keeping quiet for 3 weeks, which turned out to be a great deal more than he had realized. Her hand moved from his jaw to the back of his neck and he reached for her, and they stayed like that for a long, warm, suspended moment in the small room with the stove and the horses and the winter outside, and when they finally pulled apart both of them were breathing differently. She said, I chose to come to your gate. You were wounded and it was the first gate you found, he said. No, she said, and the amber eyes were direct and certain. I had passed 2 other gates. A stockman's holding a grain trader's post. I kept walking. She paused. I do not fully understand why, but I want you to know that I chose your gate. He had no words for what that did to him, so he said nothing, and she seemed to understand that, because she settled back and picked up her blade and the whetstone again, and he sat with his tools in his lap, and the rest of the night passed in that changed silence until they had to sleep. The following night they went. Thomas moved through the garrison as he always did, carrying a farrier's bag and the particular air of a craftsman arriving to deal with a problem, because horses did not keep civilized hours. He had arranged to have it known that one of Lieutenant Aldrich's horses had been favoring its right fore, which was true enough. The horse had developed a small abscess earlier in the week, and Thomas had been monitoring it. A legitimate reason to be in the northeast stable at the 4th hour of the night. Mazoga came separately, over the garrison's rear palisade wall, at a section he had identified as having a blind spot between 2 torch brackets. She moved the way he had come to expect her to move, with a silence and economy that seemed impossible for someone of her size, and she was waiting in the alley between the northeast stable and the food store when he slipped out the stable's side door. They did not speak. The map was in both their heads. The back wall of the stockade was rough stone, mortared badly enough that there were footholds, and the window was at shoulder height on Mazoga, which meant at just above forehead height on Thomas. He handed her up, and she braced herself in the window frame while he worked the bar spreader. It was, as he had predicted, not subtle. There was a grinding creak as the central bar bent outward and they both froze, listening. The guards' voices were distant, a steady murmur from the gate on the far side of the enclosure not approaching. He finished the spread. Mazoga leaned in and spoke in low Orcish. A pause, a response rough and sleep-thick but alert. Then movement. Groth Bloodhorn, when he pulled himself up to the window, looked like 3 weeks of captivity and cold. He was a larger man than Thomas had pictured, even broader through the shoulder than his sister, with the same amber eyes above a beard that had grown ragged, and bruises on his face that had healed to yellow and green. He looked at Thomas with open suspicion. Mazoga said something brief and pointed. Groth looked at Thomas again. Then he grabbed the spread bars and pulled himself through the window with a controlled grunt, and Thomas caught his weight from below and helped lower him, which was something like trying to guide a falling timber, but they managed it without a crash. They moved through the alley and to the rear palisade. There Thomas faced the problem he had known was coming, getting Groth over a 10-foot wall in a compromised physical state quietly. He had brought rope, he had thought it through. What he had not fully thought through was the noise. As Groth went over the wall, his boots scraped against the timber with a sound that rang out in the winter silence like a bell. A guard on the near watchtower called out. Thomas looked up and saw the torch moving. "Go," he said to Mazoga. "Get him over and go." "What about you?" "I have a reason to be here," he said. "I am a farrier. Go." She looked at him with those eyes for one sharp, burning second. Then she grabbed her brother's arm and they went over the wall. Thomas walked back into the main yard with his bag on his shoulder and his face composed and his heart hammering hard enough that he was certain it was audible. The guard came around the stable end with a torch and stopped. "Winslow, what are you doing out?" "Checking on Aldrich's horse," Thomas said. "Abscess is draining, messy business. I was outside to clean my hands." He held up hands that were, in fact, slightly dirty from the rope and the bar spreader. "Everything all right?" The guard looked at him for a long, assessing moment. Thomas met the look with the mild expression he had learned to deploy over 4 years of careful living. "Thought I heard something," the guard said. "Wind off the waists," Thomas said. "Does strange things off these walls. Ask any man who has been stationed here more than a month." Another moment. The guard nodded and walked on. Thomas walked to the northeast stable and sat down on a barrel in the dark and waited for his hands to stop shaking. They met 2 hours later at the farrier yard, in the stable, with the horses as witnesses. Groth sat on the bench near the stove, and Mazoga stood close to him, and Thomas could see from the way she positioned herself that she was simultaneously glad her brother was alive and checking him over clinically for damage. Groth ate everything Thomas put in front of him and said very little in any language. When Groth finally looked across the stable at Thomas and spoke, it was in Orc-accented common tongue that was slower and more deliberate than his sister's. "She says you helped," he said. "Yes," Thomas said. "Why?" Thomas had already given this answer twice now, and it came easier the third time. "Because it was right." Groth looked at him for a long time. Then he said something to Mazoga in Orcish that Thomas could not follow. Mazoga answered briefly, and Thomas could not tell from her tone whether it was agreement or deflection. Groth looked at Thomas once more and nodded once slowly. It was not gratitude exactly. It was something more formal than gratitude. It was acknowledgement. Groth needed to leave before Caldmere woke up and the garrison discovered the stockade empty. They had, Thomas estimated, perhaps 4 hours before the change of guard. He gave Groth everything he could spare: a heavy wool coat, dried provisions, a skin of water, and directions to the nearest ford on the eastern edge of the Ashfin, which he knew from the cavalry's own patrol maps. Mazoga put it all together with efficient hands and very little conversation. Her focus had turned entirely to the logistics of survival. At the stable door, before Groth left, she held him by both arms and spoke to him in Orcish for a long time, low and fierce and urgent. He listened and answered, and then he pulled her into an embrace that was, Thomas thought, one of the most plainly loving things he had ever seen, the kind of embrace between people who had survived enough together that physical demonstrations of feeling had been stripped back to their absolute essential core. Then Groth Bloodhorn walked out into the pre-dawn dark and was gone. Mazoga stood at the open stable door and watched the direction he had gone for a long time. Thomas stood beside her and also said nothing. After a while she turned back inside and he closed the stable door and he fed the stove and she sat near it, and neither of them talked about the noise the boot had made against the wall or about what it meant that the garrison would wake up to a missing prisoner and a farrier who had been logged as present on the grounds at the relevant hour. He said instead, "Are you all right?" She looked at the stove. "Yes," she said. "Then, no, then, I do not know. I have been carrying that for 3 weeks. Now it is set down, and I do not know what to do with my hands." He put his hand over hers where they rested on her knees. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his, and they sat by the stove in the dark until the sky outside began to go gray. The garrison's response was faster than Thomas had hoped and roughly as unpleasant as he had feared. By mid-morning, Sergeant Harwick was back at the farrier yard with 4 soldiers and a written order from Colonel Aldrich requiring Thomas to present himself for questioning. He went because going voluntarily was better than being brought by force, and because his story was clean and his hands were steady. The questioning lasted 3 hours. Thomas repeated the truth about the horse, about the abscess, about cleaning his hands. He said he had heard a sound but attributed it to wind. He said he had seen no one unusual. He said it with the same mild honesty he brought to everything, and Aldrich was a calculating man rather than an intuitive one, and calculating men needed evidence. The evidence against Thomas Winslow amounted to his presence in the yard at the relevant hour, which was legitimately explained, and a guard's account of a conversation that had been, by all appearances, entirely unremarkable. Aldrich dismissed him but kept the file open. When Thomas returned to the farrier yard that afternoon, Mazoga was not in the stable. He found her on the roof of the lean-to-wood store, lying flat on its slope in the pale winter sun, watching the market road with her arms folded under her chin. She looked from a certain angle like a very large and very alert cat. "You are making yourself obvious," he said, looking up at her. "I am watching to see if they sent anyone," she said. "They did not. I would have noticed." He paused. "Come down before someone on the road sees a green face watching them from a rooftop." She came down with a fluid drop that she seemed to feel no need to make look anything other than exactly what it was, and landed beside him in the yard. "How did it go?" she asked. "Fine. I am not under arrest." "Aldrich is suspicious, but he cannot prove anything." He looked at her. "The ransom message goes in 6 days. When it does not come from a useful position of strength because the leverage is gone, Aldrich will be furious. I want to be prepared for that." "Meaning?" "Meaning I have been in Caldmere for 4 years and I have been careful not to make enemies, but I made a choice last night that may have closed that chapter. I need to think about what comes next." She looked at him with those amber eyes that did not flinch from things. "What do you want to come next?" she asked. The question was simple and enormous at the same time. He had not been asked what he wanted in a considerable while. He found that the answer was clearer than he might have expected. "I want to keep doing what I am doing," he said. "The work, the horses." He paused. "I want to keep you." The words came out more directly than he had planned, but he did not take them back. Mazoga's expression did something complicated, a movement across those strong features that was not shyness exactly, but was something in the direction of it which he found so unexpected and so disarming that he felt his own chest tighten. "You are saying this now," she said, "while we are waiting for a garrison colonel to decide whether to arrest you." "Timing has never been my particular skill," he agreed. She looked at him for a long moment and then she said, "I was not going to leave anyway." He felt that the way you feel a fire when you have been cold for a long time, a physical thing, spreading out from a central point. The next 4 days were tense in the specific way that waiting is tense, when the thing you are waiting for is not good and there is nothing to do but prepare. Thomas moved through his work and kept his ears open. Mazoga stayed in the yard and worked with the horses, because she needed something to do, and she was better with them than anyone he had ever watched. He noticed the cavalry horses were calmer when she worked them. She noticed him noticing, and said nothing about it, but the corner of her mouth moved. They ate together every evening and talked into the night in the tack room, and each evening was a little less guarded than the one before, a little more of the interior self on each side of the table. He learned things about her, that she had led her first tactical formation at 19 and had been afraid but had not shown it, that she had a scar on her right forearm from a different battle, older than the one on her face, from when she was 22 and still learning what she had not yet learned. That she valued the winter dark over summer because in the summer everything expected too much of you and the winter asked only that you survive. That she had never been in a settlement like Caldmere before, surrounded by human buildings and human expectations, and that it made her feel like a thing that was slightly too large for the container it was in. He told her things too. The workshop in Westmark. The girl he had not been good enough for, whose face he could no longer clearly recall. The 4 years of early mornings and late nights, and the particular brand of loneliness that was not painful exactly, but was very quiet, the kind that settles in without announcement and becomes indistinguishable from ordinary life. He said all of this without drama, and she listened without pity, which was exactly how he needed it to be. On the 5th day, late in the afternoon, she was working a young stallion on a lead in the yard, and Thomas was watching from the fence with a cup of cooling tea when 2 off-duty soldiers from the garrison came down the market road and stopped at the fence. They were young men, neither of them old enough to have been at the red shelf, and they had the particular combination of bored and belligerent that young soldiers in garrison postings develop when they have not been given enough to do. One of them said something about the orc to his companion, loud enough to be heard but quiet enough to maintain deniability, the kind of thing that was not quite a direct confrontation because it was not addressed to anyone, and Thomas felt the familiar cold clarity that came to him when something was about to require him to be solid. He set down his cup. "Something I can help you with," he said, walking to the fence. The first soldier looked at him. "Just watching the show," he said. "Interesting animal you have in your yard, Winslow." In the yard, Mazoga had stopped moving. She was standing very still with the stallion's lead in her hand, and she was looking at the 2 soldiers with the flat, level stare that had been one of the first things Thomas had seen of her. "The interesting animals in my yard are horses," Thomas said. "The rest are people. I would appreciate if you kept that distinction clear when you are standing at my fence." The soldier's face shifted. His companion put a hand on his arm. "Easy, Winslow," the second one said. "We are just passing." "Then pass," Thomas said, a tense pause, the kind that could go several ways. Then the first soldier shrugged with exaggerated unconcern and they moved on down the road. Thomas turned back to the yard. Mazoga was watching him from the middle of the yard with the stallion standing calmly at her shoulder and something in her expression that was new, that he had not seen before, something that was, he thought, very close to warmth. She did not say anything about it. But that evening at supper, she sat closer to him than she usually did, close enough that their arms touched when they moved, and she did not move away. The 6th day brought Aldrich's messenger to the farrier yard, not a soldier this time, but a civilian clerk with a sealed letter that informed Thomas Winslow that his garrison contract for horse services was, effective immediately, suspended pending review of his activities, and that he should consider himself under informal notice that continued harboring of enemy combatants would result in formal charges. Thomas read it twice, put it on the table, and went to find Mazoga. She was in the stable, working a loose shoe on the dappled gray that was technically still in his care, and she looked up when he came in. He handed her the letter. She read it, which told him she read common tongue better than she let on, and when she had read it she set it down and looked at him, and the expression on her face was something rare in Mazoga Bloodhorn. It was guilt. "This is because of me," she said. "This is because of Aldrich," he said. "Thomas, I made the choices I made," he said firmly. "Every one of them. I do not regret any of them." What I need to know is what comes next, because the contract was most of my income and I cannot stay in Caldmere indefinitely without it. She was quiet. Then, if you came east, into the Ashfin territory. With you, the Bloodhorn bands owe you a debt, she said, for Groth. There is a settlement at the eastern edge of the Ashfin, an old outpost where the war ended last time. Humans and orc traders both use it. A farrier there would not go hungry. He looked at her. You have been thinking about this. For several days, she admitted. Were you going to tell me? I was building up to it, she said, with an inflection that, coming from anyone else, he might have called sheepish. He thought about it. He was a man who had left Westmark when Westmark had decided not to need him. He had built something good here, and Aldrich had just made it clear that good was not sufficient protection against a man with power who had been made to look foolish. He could fight the suspension, but fighting it would keep him in this small town with this slowly closing circle of tolerance, and he was tired of small and closing. He looked at the gray mare who was patiently waiting for her shoe to be finished. He looked at Mazoga. He said, "Tell me about this outpost." Her eyes lit. He had not seen her eyes light before, and the effect was something he wanted to see again as soon as possible. They decided to leave in 3 days. Thomas had debts to settle, tools to pack, and the horses to make arrangements for. The cavalry animals needed to be returned to the garrison in an orderly way, and he would not leave them unsettled. He spent those 3 days working with the focus of a man who was shutting one door in order to open another. Mazoga helped, efficiently and without sentimentality, and there was an ease between them now that had not been there even a week ago. The ease of two people who have decided something and feel the relief of the decision settled in their bones. On the second evening of those 3, while he was checking the pack weights and she was mending a strap on her leather bodice by firelight, she said, without looking up from the strap, "In Orcish tradition, there is something called a blade claim." He set down the pack weight. "Tell me." "It is not a ceremony," she said. "It is a declaration. A warrior says it when she has decided someone is hers to fight beside and hers to come home to. It is said in the presence of fire, and it means that she will stand for that person and with that person until she cannot stand anymore." She finished the stitch on the strap and looked up. "I am telling you what it is so that if I say it you know what it means." He held her gaze. The fire was burning low and orange between them. "Say it," he said. She looked at him for a very long moment, making sure he meant it, and then she said it, 3 words in Orcish, low and clear, and even though he did not know the language, the weight of them was unmistakable. He said, "I do not have a tradition as old or as formal as that. What I have is a simple sentence in common tongue." He held her eyes the way she had held his. "I choose you, Mazoga Bloodhorn. Wherever you go, I go. Whatever you stand for, I stand beside." She was quiet for a moment, and the firelight was doing interesting things to her eyes. Then she stood up and crossed the small space, and he stood to meet her, and she kissed him the way she had done in the tack room, but different, deeper than that, with the weight of the decision in it, and he put his arms around her and held on. The 3rd day did not go as planned. They were loading the mules in the gray pre-dawn when the garrison came. Not Harwick this time, and not 2 soldiers. 6 soldiers mounted, with Colonel Aldrich himself riding behind them, wearing his formal coat over his cold-weather riding gear, which told Thomas that this had been planned and rehearsed and was intended to look official. Thomas came out of the stable door with a halter in his hands and found himself looking at 6 horses and Aldrich's hard, administrator's face. "Winslow," Aldrich said, "I have a warrant for the arrest of the orc female on your property, on grounds of enemy combatant status and complicity in the theft of a garrison prisoner." Thomas did not move. "Her name is Mazoga Bloodhorn," he said. "And the border compact does not grant you arrest authority over non-combatant survivors of a concluded engagement without formal charges being filed with the circuit magistrate, which you have not done." Aldrich's jaw tightened. "We will discuss the legal niceties at the garrison." "We will discuss them here," Thomas said, and did not step aside. Behind him, he heard the stable door. Mazoga came out and stood beside him, not behind him, beside him, and she was wearing her leathers, and she was very still, and the 6 soldiers shifted in their saddles in the instinctive way that people shifted, when something they had expected to be a routine task had suddenly reminded them that it was not. Aldrich looked at Mazoga with the practiced contempt of a man who had spent his career thinking in categories. "Stand down," he said, and he was talking to Thomas. "I'm standing exactly where I want to stand," Thomas said. One of the soldiers dismounted and came forward. Thomas blocked the path to Mazoga with his body, not with a weapon because he did not have one, but with the solid, planted fact of himself between her and harm. The soldier hesitated. Aldrich said, "Remove him." What happened next was fast. The soldier reached for Thomas's arm and Thomas went with the motion rather than against it, turning into it and coming around, which he had learned not from fighting training, but from 4 years of managing spooked horses, where the rule was never plant your feet against a force bigger than you, redirect it. It bought him 2 seconds and placed him between 2 soldiers rather than in front of them. Mazoga, in those same 2 seconds, had moved with a speed and precision that caused all 6 horses to shy simultaneously, and 2 of the soldiers to grab their reins and forget about everything else. She was beside Thomas again before the soldiers had fully registered what had happened, and she said in a voice of absolute controlled authority, "You will not touch him." The morning was very cold and very still. Aldrich was managing a plunging horse, and the 2 soldiers who had dismounted were looking at Mazoga with the specific expression of men recalibrating. She had not drawn the short blade from her boot. She did not need to. She was Mazoga Bloodhorn, bladewarden of the Bloodhorn warband, and she was standing in the gray dawn beside a man she had claimed, and the whole field of the confrontation had shifted. Thomas said, loudly enough for all 6 soldiers to hear clearly, "Colonel Aldrich, I'm a free citizen of the border settlements. I have not been charged with any crime by the circuit magistrate. I am choosing to leave this settlement with my animals and my property and the woman at my side. If you attempt to stop us through force rather than through lawful process, I will file charges with the magistrate by the next courier post, and I will have 6 witness accounts of this morning available for that filing." He paused. "Step aside." The long pause that followed was the most suspended moment Thomas had ever stood in. He could feel Mazoga beside him, warm and steady, and he stood in the knowledge that he had said the most direct and irreversible thing he had ever said in his life. Aldrich looked at him. Then he looked at Mazoga. Then at his 6 soldiers, 2 of whom were still dealing with horses who had not yet forgiven being startled. He calculated. Thomas could see him doing it. The border settlements were far from the circuit courts, but not so far that a formal complaint from a well-regarded civilian craftsman, backed by witnesses, could not cause an uncomfortable amount of administrative trouble for a colonel who had already lost a prisoner through uncertain circumstances. Aldrich said, "Get off my roads." He turned his horse and rode back toward the garrison, and after a moment his soldiers followed. Thomas let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like several minutes. Mazoga said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You did not have 6 witness accounts." "No," he agreed. "You bluffed." "I preferred to call it an optimistic assessment," he said. She turned to look at him, and what was on her face was so open and so fierce and so entirely itself that he wanted to keep looking at it for a very long time. "We need to move quickly," she said. "He will change his mind." "I know," Thomas said. "Get the mule." They loaded in 20 minutes and were on the eastern road in the gray morning light with the wind at their backs and the garrison of Caldmere diminishing behind them, and Thomas Winslow felt something lift off his chest that he had been carrying for so long he had stopped noticing its weight. The road east ran alongside the edge of the Ashfin Wastes, a flat gray expanse of frozen marsh that in summer would be impassable, but in deep winter was firm enough to cross if you knew it. Mazoga knew it. She moved across the frozen ground with an instinct that came from a lifetime in this landscape, reading the shade of ice and the depth of snow with a skill that Thomas watched and trusted, and he followed her lead without hesitation. They had been traveling for the better part of an hour when she said, "The garrison will not follow us into the Ashfin." "I know," he said. "Not because they are afraid of us," she clarified. "They do not have patrol authorization for this territory. Aldrich would need command approval to pursue into Orc-claimed land, and command approval requires a formal incident report that he does not want to write." "I know," Thomas said again. "The border compact cuts both ways. I told you I knew it." She looked at him sideways, the amber eyes warming. "You knew that when you said it this morning." "Yes." "You were calm," she said. "When they came, I expected you to be frightened." He thought about this honestly, as he thought about most things. "I was frightened," he said, "but you were beside me. That made it different." She was quiet for a few steps. "Then, I thought the same thing about you being beside me." The road east became a track, and the track became a trail, and the trail eventually gave way to a long, flat ridge of basalt that rose above the frozen marshes and let them see for miles in every direction. The smoke of Caldmere to the west, going small and then smaller, the dark, bare tree line of the eastern Ashfin ahead, and above them, enormous and absolute, the winter sky. Thomas stopped his mule and looked at it all. Mazoga stopped beside him. She said, "My people say that when you can see the horizon in all four directions, you are standing in the center of your life." He looked at her. She was looking at the horizon with an expression that was peaceful in a way he had not seen on her before, a peace that was not absence of feeling but fullness of it. "Are we in the center of our life?" he asked. She turned to look at him, and the amber eyes were clear and warm and entirely present. "I think so," she said. "Yes." What came next was not what Thomas had expected, which was a long journey followed by a cautious arrival among suspicious orc warriors who might or might not honor the debt they owed him. What actually happened was more complicated and more alive than his expectations, which was, he was beginning to understand, the consistent nature of the life he was entering. The first orc outriders found them on the second day of travel, two scouts who materialized from the frozen tree line with crossbows trained and identities unreadable under their winter gear. And the entire situation was resolved in about 30 seconds when Mazoga spoke, and both scouts went from taut and dangerous to something approaching reverence. She was, it turned out, not merely a respected war leader. Among the Bloodhorn bands, Mazoga was something closer to a legend, the bladewarden who had survived the Red Shelf when most had not, who had walked 10 days through the winter waste, who had got their chief back from a human garrison with no warband and no resources, and a single human farrier at her side. Thomas heard his own name come up in Mazoga's explanation, and watched both scouts look at him with an expression that was not, to his considerable relief, hostile. It was closer to impressed. This was, he would discover, the general orc community's reaction to him, a curiosity that was frank and unashamed, and which he met with the same mild steadiness he had been bringing to novel situations his whole life. The eastern settlement was called Ashmark, and it was exactly what Mazoga had described, an old outpost at the boundary of two territories, human and orc traders moving through it, low stone buildings mixed with hide-covered orc structures, a permanent market in the central square that operated in 3 languages and accepted 3 currencies, and was generally too busy with commerce to be particularly interested in politics. Groth Bloodhorn was at Ashmark when they arrived. He was on his feet and largely recovered, still thinner than he should have been. The yellow bruises faded to almost nothing, surrounded by a substantial number of Bloodhorn warband members who were apparently doing a very thorough job of ensuring he did not overexert himself. He saw Mazoga across the market square and crossed it in long strides, and the embrace they shared was not the desperate one Thomas had witnessed in the stable but something quieter and more settled, the embrace of 2 people who had reached solid ground. Then Groth looked at Thomas and said, in common tongue, "I understand I owe you more than I can easily pay." "You do not owe me anything," Thomas said. "I did what was right." Groth studied him for a long moment with amber eyes that were his sister's eyes and said, "She told me about you. I want you to know that I understand what it means that she spoke of you the way she did." Thomas looked at Mazoga. She was watching both of them with an expression that was carefully neutral, and which he was now skilled enough to read as the specific neutrality that covered self-consciousness. "I understand what it means too," Thomas said. Groth nodded once, in the same slow, formal way he had nodded in the stable. Ashmark had what it needed. A farrier's post that had stood empty for the better part of a year since the previous farrier, an older man named Carrick, had retired back to the settled lands. The post was a stone building with a forge room and a stable for 6 horses, and a small adjoining living space that had belonged to Carrick, and was still furnished with his iron stove and his heavy table and his bookshelves. It was austere and it was functional, and when Thomas walked through it for the first time he felt it settle around him the way good work settles into calloused hands. He set up his forge on the 2nd day and had customers on the 3rd. The horses of Ashmark came from 3 different worlds: cavalry remounts that garrison outriders rode in the borderlands, orc warband mounts that were stocky and fiery and opinionated, and the mixed-breed working animals of the settlement's traders and farmers. Thomas loved all of them equally and without discrimination, which turned out to be an excellent policy in a place where the 2-legged residents viewed each other with considerable more caution than they extended to animals. Mazoga established herself without ceremony. She had a role at Ashmark, not a formal one with a title, but a real one built from the fact that she knew the terrain, knew the clans, knew the trade routes, and was Groth Bloodhorn's sister and bladewarden, which in orc society meant she was treated with a respect that needed no further justification. She moved between the orc and human quarters of the settlement with equal ease and an equal air of someone who had decided this place was hers and was prepared to defend that decision. She spent the evenings at the farrier's post. This was simply how it was from the beginning, without discussion or formal arrangement. She appeared at the door of the forge room in the evening, sometimes before Thomas had finished for the day, and she would sit on the stone block near the forge and watch him work or talk to him while he did it, and then they would eat together in the small living space, and when the fire was low and the conversation had wound down to comfortable silence they were already home. He did not sleep in the living space alone after the first week. She did not make an announcement about this. She was not a woman who made announcements about things she had decided. She simply decided them and was present in the decision, and he was grateful for this because it meant he did not have to find the words for something he had no interest in overthinking. The days built on each other the way honest days do, through work and argument and cooking, and the kind of small discoveries that constitute actually knowing a person rather than simply desiring them. He learned that she was particular about how she sharpened her blades and would sit with a whetstone for an hour if the edge was not precise enough. He learned that she had a low, genuine laugh that she reserved for things that were actually funny rather than things that were merely amusing, and that the first time he drew that laugh from her, by describing a specific incident involving a very opinionated cavalry mare and an unexpected puddle, he felt as proud of it as he had felt of anything in his working life. She learned that he woke up early and was useless until he had coffee, and that he had a habit of muttering to horses while he worked that was entirely unconscious, and which the horses appeared to find reassuring. She learned that he was, under the mild surface, a person of considerable conviction, that his quietness was not passivity but a form of economy, that he did not spend words on things he was not certain of, which meant that when he said something he meant all of it. She told him once, sitting by the iron stove on a night when the wind was pushing snow against the shutters, "I used to think that gentleness in a man was weakness." "And now?" he asked. She looked at him directly, the amber eyes without any shield in them. "Now I think I was confusing gentleness with the absence of strength. You are not the absence of strength, Thomas." He felt that in the deep-settled way he had learned to feel things she said that she meant entirely. "You are the only person," he said, "who has ever looked at me and seen something more than a man who is good with horses." "You are very good with horses," she said seriously. "Thank you. But you are considerably more than that." She paused. "I looked for you in a person for a long time without knowing what I was looking for. I did not expect to find you past a gate in Caldmere on a frozen night." He got up from his chair and crossed to her and sat beside her on the bench, and she leaned into him with the same naturalness with which everything between them happened, the naturalness of two people who had stopped performing for each other and were simply there. He put his arm around her, and she put her head against his shoulder, and outside the snow moved against the shutters, and the stove ticked, and the settlement of Ashmark went about its quiet winter business. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and she made a low sound that was contentment rather than a word. "I am not going anywhere," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "Neither am I." The thing with Aldrich did not end cleanly, because things with men like Aldrich rarely did. It arrived in the form of a courier from Caldmere 3 weeks into their life at Ashmark, a courier who had ridden through the winter roads with a sealed document addressed to Thomas Winslow and marked with the garrison's official seal. The document informed Thomas that a formal complaint had been filed with the circuit magistrate at Holt's Landing, charging him with unlawful interference with garrison operations, specifically the unauthorized extraction of a prisoner of war. The complaint had been filed under Aldrich's name and countersigned by 3 garrison officers. If found in favor of the complainant, it carried a penalty that included seizure of property and possible imprisonment. Thomas read it twice at the forge table while Mazoga read it over his shoulder. He set it down and thought. Mazoga said, "What happens if the magistrate rules against you?" "They would have to find me first," he said. "I am in the Ashfin, beyond formal garrison jurisdiction." "But not beyond magistrate jurisdiction," she said. "The circuit court covers all settled territories and their immediate borders." "Yes," he said. He was quiet. "I need to respond to this. If I do not respond at all, it goes to default judgment, which means they win without a hearing." He stared at the document. "I need to write a formal response and file it with the magistrate's office. I need to argue the border compact provisions." He paused. "I need a good argument, and I need it on the magistrate's desk within 40 days. Can you write it?" "I know the compact well enough," he said. "But it would be stronger with someone who can speak to the status of Groth Bloodhorn as a war prisoner versus a civilian detainee, and to the specific provisions that govern Orc survivors in concluded engagements." Mazoga said, without any hesitation, "Groth can provide a formal clan statement. Under the Third Ashfin Accord, clan warlords have standing to submit statements to circuit courts on matters involving clan members' status." Thomas looked at her. "I did not know you knew that." "I did not know you knew the border compact," she said. "We are both full of surprises." He laughed, and she smiled, and he reached across the table and took her hand because it was reflex now, the same reflex as breathing. They spent 4 days on the document together, Thomas writing in common tongue and Mazoga providing the treaty precedents and clan law context that turned his argument from reasonable to watertight. Groth contributed a formal statement with the Bloodhorn warlord's seal that arrived the evening after they had started. Because Mazoga had sent a rider the same afternoon, she had finished reading Aldrich's complaint, which was, Thomas thought, one of the more efficient things he had ever witnessed. The completed response went to the magistrate's office at Holt's Landing on a cold, clear morning, carried by a courier Thomas paid with money he had earned from 2 weeks of shoeing horses in Ashmark, which gave him a particular satisfaction. Then they waited. The 40 days that followed were not empty or anxious. They were full of ordinary life, which Thomas had come to understand was not ordinary at all. The forge work was steady, because Ashmark's horse population had immediately taken to the new farrier with a thoroughness that kept him busy from dawn to mid-afternoon. The Orc warband animals were his particular favorites, squat and intelligent and wildly opinionated, and the warriors who brought them were initially suspicious of the human farrier, and progressively less so as they watched him work with a skill and respect for the animals that was unmistakable. Mazoga rode with him sometimes, on the days when she was working the eastern patrol routes for Groth's band, checking the Ashfin crossings, and the supply caches that the warband maintained through winter. He went with her not because he was needed, but because she asked him, and he had found that there was no activity he was not willing to do if it was done beside her. They rode the frozen wastes in the gray winter light, and she taught him the names of the landmarks in Orcish, and he taught her the common-tongue names of the horse ailments he most often treated, and they talked about everything and nothing in the way of people who were not filling silences but genuinely interested in the continuous fact of each other. One morning, deep in the Ashfin on a ridge above a frozen lake, she stopped her horse and pointed. "Bloodhorn Ridge," she said. "Where the band winters in the caves above the lake, where I was born." He looked at the dark ridge against the winter sky. It was stark and magnificent, the way the whole of this landscape was stark and magnificent, nothing soft about it but real and enduring in a way that softer places were not. "Take me there someday," he said. She looked at him with those amber eyes. "Yes," she said. "Not eventually or perhaps, just yes." They were on that ridge on a morning that had started clear and turned quickly into something worse when the situation with Aldrich's men found them. It was not Aldrich himself. It was 3 men, probably hired riders rather than garrison soldiers, because they were not in uniform and they were moving through the Ashfin in a way that suggested they had been hired to find something rather than to do anything official. Thomas noticed them before Mazoga did, which was unusual enough that she turned immediately to see what he was looking at. 3 riders below on the lake ice, moving toward the base of the ridge. "They are not warband," she said. "No," Thomas said. "They are tracking our path. We left marks in the snow coming up." She assessed the situation in about 2 seconds. "They followed us from Ashmark." "That would be my read," Thomas said. Looked at the ridge behind them. "Where does this go?" "East face drops 60 feet to a ledge," she said, "then another 40 to the lakeside." Thomas looked at the 3 riders, then at the ridge behind them, then at Mazoga. "How good is the ledge?" She gave him a look that contained a significant amount of information. "It is not wide, but it is there." "Thomas, how far is the east base of the ridge to Ashmark by the lake shore?" 2 miles. She was reading his face. "You are thinking about the east face." "I am thinking about not being caught on a ridge by 3 hired men with unknown instructions," he said. "The east face gets us down and onto the lake shore and into cover faster than going back down the way we came, where they will see us from below. The jump to the ledge is 15 feet, she said. "With horses." "No, without horses through the snow." She looked at the horses. He could see her working through it. "We tie them high on the west slope. They will not be harmed. We can send warband riders for them." Thomas looked at the 3 riders. They were close enough now that he could see they were moving with purpose. He looked at the east face of the ridge, which was a vertical wall of basalt with a snow-covered ledge visible perhaps 15 feet below the rim. He thought about it for approximately 3 seconds. "Tell me where to land," he said. She looked at him with something that was equal parts alarm and exhilaration. "Do you trust your legs?" "I trust them enough," he said. "Stay loose when you hit," she said. "Left of center on the ledge. There is more snow there. It will absorb." They tied the horses. The horses were not pleased about this, but the horses would be fine. Mazoga went first. She went over the edge with the controlled intention of a woman who had been over edges before, a drop and a roll that disappeared below the rim, and then her voice came up, calm and precise. "Clear. Left of center. Now." Thomas Winslow, a farrier from Westmark, stood at the edge of a basalt cliff in the middle of the Ashfin wasteland in winter and looked down 60 feet of vertical rock face to a snow-covered ledge that was, generously estimated, 4 feet wide. He thought about what he was doing here, about the 4 years of silence in Caldmere, about the gate that had rattled in the winter dark, about amber eyes that had held no pleading in them. He jumped. The world went briefly enormous. Wind and rock face and gray sky, and then the ledge coming up very fast, and he hit left of center and went into the snow roll without thinking about it, and the impact rattled through his knees and his shoulder, and he slid to the inner edge of the ledge and stopped against the rock wall, out of breath and intact. Mazoga was beside him immediately, her hands on his shoulders, checking him with the efficiency of a battlefield medic. "I am all right," he said breathlessly. "You are insane," she said, with a fierceness that had warmth underneath it. "You did it first," he pointed out. "I am trained for it." But she kept her hands on his shoulders for an extra moment, and he could feel in the grip that she had been frightened for him, and he put his hand over hers briefly. The ledge gave onto a sloping scree field that they descended carefully and quickly, and then they were on the lake shore and moving into the reed cover along the eastern bank, and the 3 riders on the lake ice were a distant small problem rather than an immediate one. They came into Ashmark from the eastern approach an hour later, cold and somewhat snow-covered and still alive, and Mazoga went directly to Groth and told him about the hired riders, and Groth sent warband scouts to retrieve the horses and deal with the problem at the ridge in the particular way that orc warlords dealt with problems, which was thorough and left no ambiguity. The hired riders did not return to wherever they had come from. The horses came back the next morning, safe and mildly insulted. Thomas spent 2 days noticing new bruises in new places, and then decided they were a reasonable price. Mazoga spent those same 2 days watching him with a specific expression that contained, he thought, a large amount of emotion that she was not yet ready to put into words, and which expressed itself instead as the habit of touching him lightly each time she passed him, a hand on his arm, or his shoulder, or the back of his neck, each brief contact a small declaration. On the 3rd evening after the jump, she said, sitting across from him at the table with the iron stove warming the room behind her, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "I have been a war leader for 12 years, she said. "I have fought in 4 campaigns. I have watched people die. I have made decisions that put people in harm's way, and I have lived with those decisions." She paused. "I have never been afraid for another person the way I was afraid when you went over that edge." He was quiet. "I have been trying to be careful about this," she said, "about what I feel, about saying it fully, because saying it fully is the kind of thing you cannot unsay." "I know," he said. "I love you," she said. The words came out with the same directness and weight she gave to everything she said when she meant it entirely. "That is the full version. I want you to know I am not afraid of it." Thomas Winslow had not heard that sentence said to him in a long time, and never with this quality of certainty behind it. The certainty of a woman who had survived the Red Shelf and 10 days in the winter waste and a cliff jump in Caldmere and a garrison colonel, and who looked at him the way she looked at the horizon, like he was the center of something real. He said, "I love you, Mazoga Bloodhorn." And then, because he had been thinking about saying it honestly for some time, "I think I started falling in love with you the night you stood in my gate and refused to plead. I have never known anyone who stared the world down the way you do." She smiled then, the full smile, not the ghost of it or the corner of it, the real one, and it transformed her face into something so open and so beautiful that he felt the breath leave him. She stood and came around the table, and he stood to meet her, and she framed his face in her hands and kissed him slowly, without urgency, with all the warmth of a decision that had already been made and was simply being lived. They stayed like that for a long time while the stove ticked and the winter moved against the walls of the old outpost that had become, without formal announcement, their home. The magistrate's ruling came on a morning that was, against all reasonable expectation, sunny. One of those midwinter days where the sky was hard blue and the snow was blinding white, and everything had a clarity to it that felt like a gift. The courier arrived at the forge room while Thomas was working a set of shoes for a young orc scout stallion, a fiery animal named Ashbone by his owner, who was watching the process from the fence with the specific fascination that horsemen bring to watching other horsemen work. The courier handed Thomas the sealed document and stood waiting for his response. Thomas read it, then he read it again. The circuit magistrate at Holt's Landing had reviewed the complaint, and the response and the clan statement provided under seal of the Bloodhorn warlord, and had ruled in favor of the respondent, Thomas Winslow, on all counts. The ruling cited the Third Ashfin Accord's provisions for Orc survivors in concluded engagements, which precluded their classification as prisoners of war in the absence of an active conflict declaration, and noted specifically that the extraction of Groth Bloodhorn from garrison detention had been justified under the same Accord's protections for civilian status clan members. The complaint was dismissed. The notice of suspension of Thomas's garrison contract was ruled unlawful and voided. Colonel Vance Aldrich had been formally censured by the Circuit Court, and his report had been filed with the Regional Military Authority. Thomas set the document down on the forge table and stood in the hard winter sun, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, which was the clean satisfaction of a world that had briefly been wrong being put right. Mazoga appeared at the forge door because she had been in the adjacent stable and had heard the courier arrive and had waited, which was her particular style of patience, fully alert and apparently calm. He held the document out to her. She read it. She read it standing in the doorway with the sun on her face, and when she finished she looked at him, and what was in her eyes was complicated and warm and deeply itself. "Dismissed," she said. "Dismissed," he confirmed. She crossed to him in 3 steps and put her arms around him and held on, and he held her back, and the young Orc scout watching from the fence over the still unfitted stallion looked at them and then looked away with the tact of someone who had understood what he was seeing. After a moment Mazoga said against his shoulder, "This means you could go back, your contract is restored." "Yes," he said, "Caldmere is not such a bad posting." "No," he agreed. He pulled back enough to look at her face. "But Ashmark is better." The amber eyes held his. "Better why?" "Because Ashmark has better horses," he said. She looked at him for one flat moment, and then the full smile came, the real one, and she made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a dismissal, and he pulled her back in. The winter broke slowly, the way real winters break, not with a single dramatic thaw but with a series of hesitations and retreats, a mild day followed by 3 cold ones, patches of bare ground appearing in the south-facing slopes and disappearing again before spring took them back. The Ashfin's margins softened at the edges, and the frozen lake that Thomas had seen on the ridge that day began to show dark patches where the ice was thinning, and the water moved again beneath. The settlement of Ashmark moved into the season's change with the practical energy of a place that knew how much there was to do before summer and had no interest in wasting the good days. The market square grew busy again with traders who had waited out the worst roads. New horses came through, which kept Thomas at the forge from first light. Groth's warband extended its patrol routes as the Ashfin thawed and became passable, and Mazoga rode with them 3 days in 4, checking the eastern territory with an eye toward what the spring melt would do to the crossing routes. They rode to Bloodhorn Ridge on the last morning before the lake ice went entirely. She had promised to take him there, and she kept her promises, which he had come to know as a certainty. They rode up in the gray dawn, the horse's breath clouding, the ridge dark against the brightening sky. He followed her up the path she knew from childhood, through stands of bare black-barked trees and over the basalt steps to the caves above the lake, which were larger than he had expected and very old, their walls marked with the paintings and carvings of Bloodhorn generations, hunting scenes, battle formations, figures he did not recognize but which she named for him as they moved through, names of chiefs and bladewarden and battles, a whole world living in stone. She showed him the mark her mother had made when Mazoga was born, a carved spiral with 2 tusk marks beneath it, and she touched it with one finger in a gesture so personal that he felt he was witnessing something normally kept private, and he stood quietly and held the lamp. They sat at the cave's mouth in the growing light and looked out over the Ashfin, which was beginning its slow spring transformation, the white and gray giving way at the edges to the deep brown and then eventually to the green that he had not yet seen it become. "What do you see?" she asked. "A lot of it," he said. more than I can take in at once. That is what it always looked like to me from here, she said. When I was small, like the world was too large to belong to anyone. She paused. Now I think it is large enough to belong to all of us in the right proportion. He looked at her in the growing light, with the cave at her back and the ashfin below her and her warrior's leathers darkened at the wrists from the cold morning ride, and the scar on her face that ran from brow to jaw and which he had long since stopped seeing as anything other than part of her. The way the ashfin's basalt ridges were part of the landscape, functional and defining. He said, "What proportion is right?" She considered this with appropriate seriousness. "Enough of the world to live in," she said. Enough of each other to need no other latitude. He did not have a response to that was as well crafted as hers. What he had was the truth which he gave her. "I came to the end of myself 4 years ago and I did not know it. I thought I was building something and I was just waiting. You showed up at my gate and nothing has been the same direction since." She turned to look at him fully. "I was afraid of this at first," she said. "Not of you, of this." She gestured between them. "Of wanting something outside the war frame. I had spent 12 years knowing exactly what I was for. This is different from that." "Different how?" "More real," she said simply. "More mine." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they sat at the mouth of a bloodhorn cave above a thawing ashfin lake in the first real light of a spring that was finally deciding to arrive. And he thought about the gate in the winter dark, and the lantern held out into the cold, and the amber eyes that had held no pleading and had given nothing away except, to anyone paying attention, a kind of ferocious determination to keep living. He had paid attention. That was, in the end, the whole of it. He had paid attention. He had opened the gate and held it and she had come through, and between them they had built something that neither of them had expected to find and both of them had, in different winter wastelands, been walking toward. On the ride back down the ridge, she said, "The Bloodhorn bands have a spring gathering, 3 days at the Eastern Market. Groth wants you to come, not as a guest." She paused. "As family." He understood what that meant in the Orc clan context, had been learning it over the weeks at Ashmark. Family was not a casual word among the clans. It was designation. It was declaration. It was Groth Bloodhorn looking at the human farrier who had come over a stockade wall for no reason but the right one and deciding. "I will come," Thomas said. "The bands will stare," she said. "Human men are not often brought to the spring gathering." "I have been stared at before," he said. She looked at him. "By Orc warband staring at you as my chosen, you will feel it differently." He considered this. "Are you warning me or informing me?" "Both," she said honestly. "Then I thank you for both," he said, "and I will come." She made a small sound of satisfaction and nudged her horse into a trot, and he followed her down the ridge and onto the flat ashfin floor, moving east toward Ashmark, toward the forge and the horses and the life they had made in the place where the borders met. The spring gathering was held when the first green came, and it was everything Mazoga had promised in terms of scale and everything more in terms of feeling. 3 bands, 200 warriors and their families and their horses, gathered in the broad flat basin east of Ashmark, where the Orc trading roads crossed, and the spring grass was first to come up through the thawed ground. There were fires and competitions and a great deal of food, and an amount of horn blowing that Thomas eventually learned to appreciate as enthusiasm rather than alarm. He was looked at. He was thoroughly assessed by a great many amber and dark eyes that had heard of him before he arrived, which, Mazoga informed him as they rode in, was in some ways easier and in others harder than arriving unknown. He was the human farrier who had opened his gate in winter, who had gotten the Bloodhorn chief back from a garrison stockade, who had jumped a 60-foot cliff rather than be caught, and who Mazoga Bloodhorn had named as hers. This last was, he gathered from the quality of attention people paid to it, the piece that mattered most. He bore the assessment with his usual steadiness, met eyes when they were met with him, and worked his honest face for everything it was worth. Groth introduced him formally on the first evening, in Orcish, and then in common tongue, and the introduction contained a phrase that Mazoga translated for him quietly. He said, "You are iron true," which in our language means a person who is what they appear to be, all the way through. Thomas thought about that for the rest of the evening. The spring gathering passed in 3 days of continuous life, and Thomas watched Mazoga in it, which was something different from watching her in Ashmark. Here she was entirely in her context, moving through the gathered bands with the ease of someone who had grown up among this, greeting warriors by name, adjudicating minor disputes with the same calm authority she brought to everything, sitting with Groth and the other band leaders in the evening councils. She was here the full version of herself, and the full version was magnificent in a way that Thomas already knew, but that seeing it displayed in this context made immediate and physical and irrefutable. She kept coming back to him. Through the 3 days, no matter where the gathering took her, she kept returning to where he was, a hand on his shoulder as she passed, or sitting beside him at the fire, or pulling him by the wrist to see something across the camp. Each return was small and deliberate, the consistent demonstration of a woman who had decided. On the last evening, sitting by the central fire with the gathered bands around them, she said to him quietly, "Are you glad you came?" He looked at the fire and the faces around it and then at her, the firelight amber in her eyes. "Yes," he said, "completely." She took his hand and held it on her knee, in full sight of everyone, which in Orc custom meant what it meant, and he felt the eyes on them and held her hand back with everything he had. They rode back to Ashmark on a bright morning with the spring coming up through the ashfen in sheets of green, the gray and white of winter giving way entirely now, the sky enormous and blue above the wide flat land. The horses were eager, glad for the open ground, and they let them move. Thomas Winslow rode beside Mazoga Bloodhorn through the spring ashfen, with the wind off the marshes and the grass starting green at the horses' feet and everything that had been winter finally resolved into warmth, and he thought about the man he had been on the other side of this, a quiet farrier in a cold yard in a border town, going step by step through a life that had not yet found its shape. He was still a farrier. He was still quiet. He still went step by step through the days. But the days had shape now, and the shape was hers. They came back to the forge at midday. Horses turned out into the small paddock at the east end of the property, and the familiar sounds of Ashmark settling around them, the market calls and the distant forge of the settlement smith, and the particular cadence of a place that was alive and working. He unsaddled his horse, and she unsaddled hers, and they moved around each other in the shared physical grammar they had developed, each knowing where the other would be, each making room without having to think about it. He had just hung the last saddle when she came to stand beside him at the fence, and they both looked out at the horses in the paddock, the two of them and the ashfen beyond, green and wide and fully arrived. She said without preamble, "I have been thinking about making it formal." He looked at her. "The blade claim," she said. "What I said by the fire. In our tradition, that is between the two people and the fire, but there is a formal version, said in front of the band with witnesses." She was looking at the horses, not at him, which he recognized as the particular direction of her gaze when she was saying something that mattered enough to require a fixed point. "I asked Groth. He said he would stand as witness." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "In common tongue," he said slowly, "the equivalent of that is a marriage." "Yes," she said, "I understand that. That is what you are asking." "I am not asking," she said, and she turned to look at him then, and the amber eyes were direct and clear and entirely without armor. "I am telling you that I want it. Whether you want it is a separate question which I am asking." He thought about the question. He thought about it with the thoroughness he brought to decisions that he intended to keep. Then he said, "Yes, Mazoga, that is what I want." She held his eyes for a long moment, and he could see the thing that moved through her, that rare and private loosening of the very last guard, the one she kept for the rare thing she wanted badly enough to be afraid of wanting. "Good," she said. And then, because she was Mazoga, "Then we can have the horses back in the paddock by evening." He laughed, and she laughed with him, and he pulled her into him with both arms, and she put her arms around him, and they stood at the paddock fence in the Ashfin spring with the horses and the green and everything ahead of them. And the morning was clear and warm, and the whole of the world was exactly the right size. They stood the formal blade claim 3 days later, on a morning that was as clear as the decision itself, with Groth as witness and the few Bloodhorn warband members based permanently at Ashmark as gathered audience, and 2 of the settlement's human traders who had come to know Thomas through the forge, and who stood at the edge of the circle with the respectful uncertainty of people, at a ceremony in a language they did not fully speak, but the meaning of which required no translation. Mazoga said the formal words in Orcish, slow and deliberate and entirely herself, with the fire between them and the spring Ashfin behind her, and Thomas said his portion in common tongue, and the exchange was witnessed and sealed and real. After, Groth clasped Thomas's hand in both of his and said, in his slow and deliberate way, "You are Bloodhorn now, Thomas Winslow, in the full meaning of the word." Thomas said, "That is the greatest thing anyone has ever said to me." Groth looked at Mazoga, who was standing at Thomas's side with the particular stillness of someone who had arrived exactly where they had been going, and then looked back at Thomas. "She chose well," Groth said simply. "She did," Thomas agreed. Mazoga said, "Both of you are being very admiring and I am standing right here." Groth smiled, which on his face was an event. Thomas felt Mazoga's hand find his and hold it. The feast that followed lasted into the evening, and the fire was high, and the food was good, and the spring air was soft. And Thomas sat beside Mazoga in the firelight of Ashmark, with her shoulder against his and her voice in his ear, translating the Orcish songs when she thought he would want to understand them. And he thought of all the quiet evenings in the stable in Caldmere that had been fine and sufficient, and had not been this. And he felt the distance between that life, and this one as clearly as a man feels the distance between cold and warmth, not as a judgment on the past, but as a full appreciation of the present. Later, when the fire had burned down in Groth and the others had gone and the settlement was quiet, they walked back to the farrier's post side by side in the dark. The sky above the Ashfin was enormous and full of stars, the kind of sky that required you to acknowledge that the world was large and you were small, and that both things were, in the right company, entirely acceptable. At the door of the post, she stopped and looked up at the stars, and he stopped with her. After a while she said, "I thought about not going to your gate. I want you to know that, when I saw the light. I stood in the dark for a while and I thought about walking past." "What changed your mind?" he asked. "The light," she said. "It was very small, and it was still on." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood in the door of their home in the spring dark, and the stars moved slowly overhead, and everything that had needed resolving had resolved itself into this. The dawn came the way good dawns come in the Ashfin, all at once and with colors first, the dark going deep blue and then a rose line at the east horizon, and then the orange above it, and then the sky opening up into something clean and wide and honestly itself. Thomas had been up since before it, habit, the early rising that 4 years had made second nature, and he had the fire going and the coffee on by the time the first light came in the east window. Mazoga came to the doorway of the back room and leaned against the frame and watched him at the stove, her leathers on, her hair loose, the scar on her face golden in the firelight, and she looked at him the way she had been looking at him for weeks now, openly, without the careful calibration she had applied to everything in those first days. She had stopped measuring what she showed him. There was nothing left to ration. He poured the coffee and brought her a cup, and she took it, and their fingers touched over the rim and neither of them moved away from the contact. Outside, the day was coming up gold and clear and new. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said, and she meant all of it. He stood in the doorway beside her, and they drank their coffee in the growing light, looking out at the Ashfin coming green and gold into another day, and the forge waiting for its first fire, and the horses moving in the paddock, and the market road coming awake, and all of Ashmark settling into the living day. He was Thomas Winslow, farrier, and he was not a large man or a striking one, and he had spent 4 years being no one's first thought for anything. He had opened a gate in winter and held a lantern out into the dark, and it had been enough, and the woman standing at his shoulder was the proof of it. She chose him. She had said so, standing in his gate in the winter dark with nothing but a scar and a stare. She had chosen his gate. He had not known it then, but he knew it now, and he held the knowledge the way he held her, without reservation and without any intention of letting go. The day was warm and bright and entirely theirs. They were both still standing.